You make what's hard to say easier and more human by bringing clarity and compassion and structure to some of those messy conversations. And I am over the moon today to be joined by my awe-inspiring guest, Jamie Ramsden, who is the CEO and a founder of Adastra Consulting and author of this killer book, Let's Go, How Great Leaders Shape the Future. Jamie, thank you for joining me.
Molly, I'm so excited to be here today. I'm feeling a little bit under pressure to be able to say it skillfully, seeing as I'm on your show, but I'm going to try and say what I can, as well as I possibly can.
Well, you have already excelled any expectations because you can't help it. When I first met you, I'm like, wow, that guy just sounds great. You're one of those people who you are very blessed. It doesn't really matter what you're saying. You sound great. So that's a nice little superpower that you have.
Thank you.
So Jamie, when I first met you, what happened is Jamie and I met unknowingly in London, of all places. We're both in the Raleigh area, and we kind of meet there, and we're like, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, you're like 15 minutes away."
Yeah, literally around the corner. Yeah,
literally around the corner. And then one of my New Year's sort of resolutions, if you will, is I have all these amazing people, and I wanted to do more projects with people that I just love and that's super fun. And so I just want to thank you for helping me live out my resolution, because that's part of our gig here. The topic, though, is very serious and I think one of the things I really am inspired and I admire about you, Jamie, is doing the work to know what's meaningful to you, and to pursue work that you want to do and make the pivot. You've had a really amazing career. And so I know you were a CEO and then you ended up coaching CEOs. So I just thought it would be great for listeners to have a sense of how you got into your first CEO job, and then how you decided to make the pivot, and kind of the conversations we have with ourselves, because sometimes those are the ones that are most important.
Well, I think one of the things I would hope that your younger listeners could take out of this is that, in my late adolescence and early adulthood, I had no clear direction. I just knew that I was motivated by people. I wanted to have an impact on the world, but I hadn't found the vessel or the vehicle to be able to do that. And so it's okay if you can't see clearly for a period of time. That sort of struggle and grappling, with yourself and who you are and what your motivations are, is part of the human condition, and it doesn't stop at any particular time. It's something that is ongoing. So I was fortunate enough that I found a vehicle. I did good work. I lived in Europe for 5 years, and then I moved to the States in 1999, working in the automotive industry. And I worked my way up through that organization. We took it through a turnaround, and we went from one of the worst performing suppliers in the industry, like by very tangible, objective metrics that we would hit over the head with on a continuous basis, to an award-winning supplier. And that made us one of the most profitable parts of the business. And then ultimately, 10 years later, we sold to private equity. And so, I was fortunate enough to be in that role and responsibility fairly early on. But as it relates to my career pivot, I knew even during that time that coaching, helping people to unlock potential that they have in themselves, is something that I was, that I'm an instrument for that. That's simply my purpose here on planet Earth. And some of the grappling I had done to say, that's what I'd love to do, but can you do that as a job? I realized when I got coached, so I was a CEO in my early 30s, and I'd done a leadership, I'd done an MBA specializing in leadership and change management. And so by the time I got to the organization, I'm like, I don't want to do any more studying. I want to actually practically help people to lead and be better leaders. So I got certified by the Center for Creative Leadership, who are headquartered just up the road here in Greensboro, North Carolina. Their global headquarters. And I worked with them. So in terms of career pivots, let me just put this in context, which is, I had built the scaffolding for this second phase of my career, coaching CEOs, which is what I was meant to do. I built that scaffolding while I was a chief exec. And so a lot of times we sort of get to the end of a runway, or something exhausts, or we get to the end of a plateau and we feel anxious and we try and make that move. But one of the things around career pivots is, and I think Gen Z is far better at doing this because, they have to, and their careers are not sort of 20 or 30-year careers. But it's sort of building or thinking about the scaffolding that you need to put around yourself so that you can make that switch. And so for 10 years, while I was a CEO, I would spend 1 day a month, I would take time off work, and I would go and coach leaders in other organizations for the Center for Creative Leadership. I had board permission to do this as part of my leadership plan. And I would go and coach leaders all around the world who were in similar spots. And then I would drive home at the end of an exhausting day, 2 times 3.5 hours of a really deep debrief with people. And then I'd drive home at the end of the day and say, what did I learn today in these 2 examples that's relevant to the challenges that I'm having? Are these industry challenges? Are they organizational challenges? Are they challenges in the human condition? Or are they Jamie challenges because I'm not seeing clearly or being a jerk or over-indexing on something? And so that really allowed me to deepen my awareness of coaching leadership. And so after 10 years of doing these things, so I was chief exec and I was coaching other leaders, the pivot, once we sold the business, and my wife, I've got to give her credit for this because I had the opportunity to, once we sold the business, to go and do something else. And she said, Jamie, I've never seen you as motivated and animated as when you come back from those days where you're coaching people and helping to unlock potential in others. Go and do that for a full-time job, even if it means we live in an RV or we have to live in a caravan for a few years. She said, I'm committed to it and make it work. And because I built that scaffolding, I was able to make that pivot, that transition fairly seamlessly. And thankfully, we didn't have to live in an RV to make it work. We were able to, we had 4 young kids at the time, so we were still here to tell the tale. But the intentionality, so I just think that, for people to think about, especially, I've had 3 jobs. So I worked for somebody in France, I worked for somebody in, I ended up being CEO for in Goodrich, and then I have Adastra. So there's really 3 organizations that I've worked with in a 25 plus year career. I don't think, I look at my daughter and her generation, that would be an exception, that they're going to have to pivot and move and reinvent themselves and build other skills because of, there was a piece of research that said 60% of the jobs that exist today, by the time a 6-year-old becomes 26, so in 20 years' time, they won't exist. We're in that kind of, an evolutionary or revolutionary, depending on how you want to see it, we're in that type of period of time where many of the jobs that exist today will not exist. And so that requires that we're intentional about, the work that we do. We understand ourselves and what motivates us and what we want to do with our lives. There's far more opportunities today for people to go out and express themselves fully than maybe there were 20, 30, 40 years ago. But you do have to be able to adapt.
Yeah, so let's back it up because I think this inherently is sort of the opportunity we want to help folks with is you're coming up the ranks just before you even get to your CEO job, those first jobs. Mm-hmm. And the thinking about like being more intentional about actually getting to know myself and what am I experiencing and what am I learning and what am I good at? What am I not good at? So I'm sure you weren't like, let me get into automotive. That probably was not maybe the first thing you thought. So maybe talk about when you got into that. And I do want to say to folks, it is a process of sometimes of what you don't want to do, but you're still learning. So I think sometimes people in their younger feel like there needs to be this pressure of, I have to find my dream job. It has to be my passion. I'm like, I do believe passions are created. I think you were a great example of going through your journey. You started to realize what lights you up. But I am curious, when you got into those early days, were you just like, I'm just going to work my butt off? I'm sort of a fan of the work butt off program personally. Yes. I think that's a good thing. So it's just some of the any early struggles or things that you remember that were sort of ahas about yourself?
Well, I think there's 2 elements because my first job out of college was in a foreign country. And so that, that forces you to rethink, I had a lot of time on my own to do the reflection about what really motivates me. I had a lot of adaptation to do and I find this is really interesting as a sort of neurological piece, is you create new neural pathways when you're forced to, to deal with day-to-day activities that you think might be the same around the world, but you realize aren't. And so living in a different country, okay, I spoke French, that was helpful. And I'd always dreamed of working and living in France. In fact, that was my dream as a young man, was to just work and live in France because I just felt really attracted to the country. Once I got there, I actually got the best job you could ever have. So like I got my dream very early on. And yet, right, I was like, this is not, like I had to expand my horizons because I was like, yeah, I did that. I lived on a vineyard. I ran somebody's company effectively for them. Small amount of us who ran this business, and it did really well. And I was like, okay, so now what's more than this? And that was what the reflection was. And actually, if I think about the challenge I had, there was an activating conversation I had. And I don't often tell people this, but this was a really powerful conversation I had when I was 25, living and working in Europe. And I went to a trade show, and I met a CEO then who I remember was twice my age. So I was like 24, 25, and he was 50, about my age today, right? 52. And I'm not telling you who it is, and I'm not sure they're even alive anymore. So I'm not breaching confidentiality, but I had this conversation with this person where he was complaining about his kids and complaining about his work in front of a group of people. And I said, hey, hang on a minute. That's not how you talk about your family in front of a group of strangers. And the room went quiet. And it was like, nobody's ever spoken to me like that before. And so everyone around him sort of looked at me strangely, and some of them started cracking their knuckles. And I was like, okay, what have I said here? And he actually said, hey, son, come and sit next to me, because nobody's ever spoken to me like that before. No one's ever challenged me like that before. And he was a CEO surrounded by people who would tell him what he wanted to hear. And so we sat down and we had a very deep conversation that actually lasted through the night. So this was sort of in the evening in a restaurant. We lasted through the night. And he was in tears and ended up telling me his entire life story and how he felt trapped in his world. He couldn't get out. He didn't enjoy it. His relationships were broken. And I was like, so to your point about what do you not want to be? That opportunity, taught me that I can present the truth to people in a way that's challenging and still get out unscathed, which sometimes I use in my coaching work. But also that I can provide the support and the structure around how to build a life, right? How to build a life that you're not trapped in, that is not unpleasant to you. And that's really central to what I did as a CEO, and essentially why I stepped away from, the corporate world and have my own practice or my own business today. Because what's important to me are my kids. So that's my priority when I calendar. What's important to me is my relationship with my wife. That's what I prioritize when I calendar today. Yeah. And I didn't have that flexibility as a young man with young kids, 20 years ago. And so that conversation, number one, told me that this is what I was built to do. There's somebody who's twice my age, who's the CEO of $1 billion organization. And he's here crying on my shoulder, literally, and saying, I hate my life. Mm-hmm. And so I could, with one conversation, I set him on a different pathway. And I suddenly realized this is what I was born to do. But also, I could sense when I was getting away from that too, it informed my direction as a CEO, that I didn't want to get away from the things that really ground you. Health, your family, your friendships, your faith if you have it, the hobbies that you have, things that bring you joy. Mm-hmm. And so what I do today is I try and help people to keep that sort of portfolio mindset, even though the job is challenging and even though it's very difficult nowadays, right? There's all kinds of challenges that are in front of us. Mm. For me, this portfolio mindset, which is, okay, my work is a piece of my life, and that gives me a certain level of meaning and purpose and belonging and evolution of self. But there are other aspects that are important on our journey, this human development journey that we're on, that you have to keep in check. You have to keep those in check. Otherwise, you can get pulled off and end up like this fellow most people would look like the most successful person in the room. And yet all I did was scratch the surface, and underneath somebody was deeply wounded and unhappy.
This reminds me, and thanks so much for sharing that. Marshall and I were talking about, at one point he said, you're probably giving people too much credit. You're giving people credit that they probably don't deserve. Mm-hmm. Code for, you can be more, you are more than you may realize. And I think that's a really great message for people out there. I've had this term probably for the last 15 years. I call it Molly Inc., right? Jamie Inc. And even if you work full-time for a company, thinking of your life portfolio, if you will, as an enterprise, and what are the pie slices that you devote your heart and soul to. Some of it may bring you income, some of it may bring you joy, and I think having folks over time start to realize that that's a creative endeavor that really only you can do. And I wonder, I wonder when you had moments of self-doubt, if you had moments of self-doubt, and how did you head fake yourself into overcoming them?
Yeah. Well, I'll try not to get on my soapbox about imposter syndrome, because I generally don't. If people start talking to me about that, my clients, I say, you've got about 5 minutes to tell me about it, and then we're done. Because not that it isn't valid, and not that it isn't a feeling that we all go through, but at the end of the day, if the worst thing that you could do for yourself is to say you're not good enough to do something, and then create the thinking that makes that a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, if I say that out loud to people, you don't think you're good enough, and so you're going to underperform, or you're going to be stressed out or anxious in a way that makes you suboptimal in how you show up. Why would you do that to yourself? Like, if I say it out loud, people are like, yeah, okay. And so it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Of course, there's various different triggers or different scenarios that can create imposter syndrome. But I also want to say, if we give it more mind than it needs, that can itself become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so in my mind, I typically, and again, I know that I'm speaking from the position of a tall, well-educated white man. Okay, so there are other people with different profiles who have different experiences, no doubt. But self-doubt was never something that entered my mind. And I remember when I went to France, moved to France as my first job. I got to move to a different country. Okay, 25 miles away from England, but a different country. And I'm sort of pushing the boat out into the water and saying, let's hope that it survives, right? Whatever storms come our way. But the sense of perspective that I get people to think about when I work with them is, in 10 years' time, who cares? In 100 years' time, who will care about this thing that I've done, right? It really can be help you to have a sense of grounding, is that we're a tiny speck of dust in this massive universe. And so, we suddenly give ourselves, no, but this is so important, and I'm going to, it's really important that I get this done. And it's not to say that it's not. Mm-hmm. But if you have anxiety that creates suboptimal performance, then you have created the conditions for something. And so I remember when I first went to France, I was like, okay, this feels like a really big deal right now. So I'm in my early 20s. I don't know anybody there. I'm going to do a job that I've never done before. But then I remembered that my sister flew to, she studied Mandarin, and she flew to Taiwan on a one-way ticket. She didn't have enough money to get a return ticket, and she'd been working after college, and she said, no, I just need to go. She took a one-way ticket to Taiwan and said, I'll figure it out. I'll earn the money. I'll stay with friends. I'll get the job that I need, and I can come home. And that was a really live and real example of me, of what I'd say was boldness, what I would call the courage. And so by comparison, my move to France, where I spoke the language and I could I could be home in 12 hours, it seemed very small. And so what I want to always get people to, whenever I work with folks, I'm saying, just remember, however good you think you are, there's somebody better. However bad you think you are, there's somebody worse. So just do the best you can with the resources you have in front of you in this particular window of time, and don't let any of the noise get in the way.
Yeah, I just want to really reinforce this for folks. And I do, again, to Jamie's point, I don't want to downplay the imposter syndrome and all, but you have a choice, right? And you either decide that you're going to value yourself and that you think you can do it. I would say my naivete served me super well, because I just didn't really know. I mean, to your point, you spoke up to a CEO twice your age. People were like, what did you just do? You didn't even know you did anything. You're just being you. And I do think that it's sad that gets beat out of us a little bit when you start to go to work, or from a child growing up. And so I would say to folks, like Marshall said, there's more within you than you could possibly imagine. And the things that other people have overcome, which is not to say we don't have hardships, but there's countless of folks out there who have gone through way more, right? And struggles that we can't even comprehend and come off the other end. And so that ability to say, you know what, it's going to be okay. Yeah. I'm going to find a way. And I do want to also say that the idea of sharing your dreams and aspirations or your big questions is an invitation to the universe to help manifest the people who will come to your side and help you through that journey. Because I know, as you know, Jamie, none of us get anywhere without anybody else. And so a lot of what we can be very intentional about is, who do we have alongside us in the boats and the dinghies that are pushing us along? Can you tell me about some of the maybe unlikely mentors. I mean, obviously people who work directly with you could be mentors, but I'm curious if you had any surprise mentors along the way.
Well, and so here's what I was going to say. What I found interesting, and this maybe come back to the sort of meaning and purpose that we get from work, right? Because career pivots are about and sort of the meaning that we can get from work and how we create meaning for people in work. That's so central and important. But remember that I spent my first 5 years of my working career in a European country where it's very different from the UK and the US, where work becomes our identity. It really can creep into becoming our identity. And I'm just remembering that most of my close friends in France, I had no idea what they did. I know one of them owned a vineyard because we'd go there on Friday nights and sit in his wine cellar and drink wine. But the rest of it, I had no idea. Whereas I think here we can create identity and meaning through our work. It doesn't mean that it can't happen or it doesn't happen. But if we have the expectation that that's how we're going to define ourselves or have identity, then we can set ourselves up. Our thinking can set us up to fail. When I did my research 20 years ago, the reason why that's relevant is when I did my research 20 years ago, I was blown away. So I looked at the history of leadership, I looked at modern technology and was trying to see what the connection was, how it was going to evolve at that time, how e-leadership was going to evolve leadership. Like people were talking about the e-leadership and how it's going to disrupt. And essentially, it's not the what of leadership is the same. The what of leadership is still the same. It's the how that's changed. And so, but when I was interviewing people, so I interviewed people to ask them about who their heroes were and who their role models were and who the leadership, like their guides and mentors were. Almost, I would say 8 times out of 10, most of them would say my inspiration or my leadership inspiration or the mentors and guides that I've had were not in the workplace. And mine would be probably similar. I already spoke about my sister who took a one-way trip to Taiwan. Like if I think about boldness and courage, as a single woman in the early 90s, she flew to the other side of the world when you couldn't pick up the phone, and call back home. We'd get a random call sometime in the middle of the night because of the time zones. And she'd say, yeah, I'm okay. I'll call you back in a couple of weeks. So certainly in terms of courage, she showed me the way. I'd say my grandmother, who was the first, not just the first female mayor, but the first, in my hometown, the first Democrat, in our case, it would be, so she was the first Democratic mayor, the first female mayor in my hometown for 450 years. She was an absolute force of nature. And so, being around her and seeing how she operated was really inspiring for me. And she would always say to me, just do your best. That's all you can do. Just do your best. And so those two, outside of the workplace with my family. And then my parents were professional musicians. And so, so I grew up in this very sort of interesting, I'd call it bohemian maybe, lifestyle. It was a very interesting childhood. And we met and got access to all kinds of people. So we'd meet, artists and musicians, we'd meet, architects and engineers, plumbers, electricians, and then business people. And we got to see behind the veil, as young kids, we got to see what was actually that connected them all was this humanity that we all share. Doesn't matter what your title is. And I think that was really eye-opening for me. They were also, so they knew how to have fun. And I think I think I still have that capability. They knew how to connect with people, different of different ages and jobs and backgrounds and races and whatever. And I think that I learned that, certainly on my travels around the world.
Let's stay on that because that was literally where I was going to go with this because I would say I'm an introvert by design. Like my inherent nature is I derive my energy from within. I would keep to myself and I love people, love being with them, but that would be my default. So I'm curious, this connection, this innate, it seems to have an innate curiosity of people. And I'm just wondering, because I think that's such a gift when you can walk in a room, you don't have to learn to do it, where you can kind of create safety, feel that they can be real, and we can see each other and be who we are, and it's all fine, right? There's not a lot of judging, big J judging. And so I'm just wondering, when you watched your parents, and then what were you picking up that was so, I don't know, infectious for you to be able to then do it? Because you do it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it was, I mean, you said the word there. I think it was a lack of judgment. They did not judge. They tended not to judge people. Our house was open to all. So we'd have students who come over from different parts of the world, all kinds of, backgrounds. They would come and live with us and, pay with us. We had all kinds of people in the house. And to me, that was almost like a laboratory to be able to see what does connect us. And so my parents had this very non-judgmental approach to people that just brings us back to our humanity. And I think that was something that was innate. And also, I learned it at close quarters, which is, you could see somebody's behavior and you'd say, okay, that's weird. But they would pause and say, well, there's something behind that, Jamie. Like, do you know the history, or you should know the history? And so instead of like reacting to the outward expression, and that's something that we can all do, is to actually stop and get curious and pause and say, well, what's behind that? Because we don't typically we may not be conscious about what we're doing, but we're not typically doing something deliberately to, annoy or irritate or provoke or upset. Sometimes it's just an expression of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm working with leaders, one of the things I will say is, if you want to build a successful team, the first step, and it could seem like it's onerous, but if you don't do this, you will perform suboptimally at some point. You have to understand the motivations of the people around you. You have to sit and do that second step of interest, not, where you were born or what kind of family do you have, but really understanding what is it that motivates this person. And it can be a number of different things. It might be recognition. It might be being part of a winning team. It may be that I found this one with somebody that was on my team. They may just be working for the healthcare benefits, and they want the time and the flexibility to go and support an aging parent. And so then all we had to do was just to arrange their scope so that they could really perform well in that role and not have a judgment about it. And they were a really high performing contributor in that role. And so it really, if not, I'm sitting here expecting this person to be something else. Yeah. And then the expectation, the Buddhists always say, right, the root of unhappiness is expectation. Then my expectation isn't met. Yep. And then we suddenly could lose somebody who could be a really valuable contributor to us. Yeah. And so, there are times when people don't have the capability or the will or the desire to evolve and grow into role or to be adaptive and resilient. Yes, of course, in an organization, you have to make those decisions. But sometimes just that double click, that extra question or that level of curiosity about, where did that come from? Or why did that person do that? Or why are they, why did the team not get it? Most of the CEOs would just say, I thought I was clear. Why did they not get it? Well, they're not deliberately showing up to work to do a lousy job. Yeah. And so just that pause, sometimes it can feel like it takes time, and it does at the front end. Understand the team, understand whether we're aligned or not, and where we're not, remove those obstacles. But actually, once you have that alignment, then you have the direction, things flow really quickly.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to turn all of that around for our listeners and to apply it to ourselves. And I think often we judge. We were talking about tennis and you're playing soccer and, it was a bad shot. You can do the judgment, or you can think about, hey, what can I do better? What am I going to now do differently? But this idea of being curious about ourselves, I'm seeing this thing going on. I'm having this emotion. Like, why am I having it? Is that what I want to have? And that ability to hone that skill in the moment of taking that extra step. I was just reading about some 5 steps that would really help people to not overreact and to manage conflict. And a big part of it is managing in here. And so for the folks who are thinking about, I think it's a real privilege to work. I would love everyone out there to be in a place where you feel like you can spread your wings and fly. And that takes some self-work. Jamie, you went through and you got to deal with yourself. And when you confront yourself, there's sometimes things that were not so pretty, not exactly perfect. And you kind of you gotta like swallow it and deal with it. And it's okay. It is okay. The question is, are you going to let it be a boat anchor and sink you? Or are you going to move beyond that and be better for it? So everything you shared, I think would love folks to really think about it for our own lives. Because when we're grounded in ourselves, truly, and we feel secure, and we can embrace our own differences, that's what we can then generate for other people. And that really, I think, is the beauty of our great relationships. Jamie, you've been such a joy. We can go on and on. I'm going to hopefully have you and Jean over to the house so that we can continue the conversation. Folks, I want you to know that Jamie and I are both cheering for you to be who you are and say what needs to be said skillfully, right? And we know that when you say it skillfully, our relationships strengthen, performance improves, and everybody wins, folks. So go forth and conquer, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. And thanks again, Jamie, for all that you shared.
Thank you for having me on, Molly.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.